Michelle, thank you very much and welcome to everybody. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. It's 1 year American Purpose. Today's session is part of a 3-day Zoom conference. We began this morning with my friend and colleague, our co-founder, Frank Fukuyama. We'll continue this afternoon, 2 p.m. Eastern with Bob Zellick. But now we have a real gem, a real jewel, and I've been excited about this session since we planned it 3, 4, 5 weeks ago, maybe already. A quick tech talk we're using today, and thank you, Alex. We're having simultaneous interpretation. Keep that in mind, and it is simultaneous, but as we switch from speaker to speaker, a little bit of breathing space is appreciated. Frank Fukuyama, great to see you and thank you in advance. Gergely, great to see you. Mr. Mayor, we're appreciative of your valuable time joining us live from Budapest. And Sophia Gaston, who is a dear friend, a colleague. She's a prolific writer, a researcher on many things, including populism in Europe. She's also director of the British Foreign Policy Group. Sophia, welcome. You're going to do a little bit of intellectual scene setting for us. You're going to properly introduce our 2 speakers who will be in conversation for approximately 30 minutes. And you've kindly agreed also to facilitate the Q&A at the end. Thank you for that. We'll have a hard stop, 1 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Budapest. Sophia, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and it's wonderful to be with you all. I have to say my internet connection here is not ideal, so I may have to go off camera at a couple of points, but hopefully not. Thanks for bearing with me. So my name's Sophia Gaston. I'm the director of the British Foreign Policy Group. I'm also a social researcher and a friend and hopefully soon collaborator with American Purpose as well. It's a great pleasure to be joined here today by 2 kind of great thinkers and doers in the pantheon of modern liberalism. And it's wonderful to be discussing Central Europe, part of the world that I have been privileged to do some research in, mainly social and political research, looking at all of these kind of deeper structural social trends that are destabilizing governance in the 21st century, things like economic and cultural insecurity, nostalgia, the rise of populism, nationalist and exclusionary forms of governance, and these kind of new battlegrounds in history and culture. And we're here to discuss the future of liberal democracy in Central Europe. And there's a reason we're focusing on this particular region in this session. Central Europe is home to the EU member state most frequently in the news as frustrating Brussels' ambitions to move forward with some aspects of the kind of political and social union, with Hungary's President Viktor Orban resisting calls for greater consensus around issues such as migration, and arguing that Europe's Christian culture is being challenged by an enforced policy of multiculturalism, pluralism, and minority rights. Viktor Orban has, of course, sought to exert influence in a number of areas in Hungary, in particular schooling, higher education, and to enforce legislation that has borne down on the media environment in Hungary as well, to the detriment of some independent outlets which had sort of conceived themselves as challenging and holding the government to account. So the shift in authoritarianism seen in parts of Central Europe and exemplified in some aspects of the recent Hungarian experience has understandably sent shockwaves throughout the EU and the European neighborhood more generally, because it challenges the optimism of 1989 and that whole era and the hopes that we had then for a kind of almost linear trajectory in the spread of liberalism. And some would also regard Hungary as perhaps foretelling some of the broader civilizational questions that we may find ourselves grappling with in the years to come. So it's wonderful to have these 2 guests here with me today. One person so deeply entwined in the kind of hope and energy of that period in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall and Europe's great kind of reopening. And another on the front lines, seeking to ensure that this vision of open and free society remains authentic and most of all effective. So with me today, we have Francis Fukuyama. He's a senior fellow at Stanford University's Institute for International Studies, professor of political science. He's written a number of hugely influential books, which I'm sure most people here are aware of, including, of course, The Seismic, The End of History, and The Last Man. His most recent book, Identity, The Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, was published in 2018. He's now the chair of American Purpose's editorial board. We also have Gergely Karácsony. I hope I have pronounced that correctly. I'm sorry. I hope I've done my best. The mayor of Budapest, seen as one of the mayor of Budapest, and seen as one of the few genuine challenges to the kind of hegemony of President Viktor Orbán's regime. He presides over one of Europe's great cosmopolitan capitals and has sought to use his position to uphold liberalism and to challenge the influence of domestic corruption and authoritarian nations also seeking to influence and exert influence within Hungary. He's also, of course, a political scientist and academic. So wonderful to have both Gergely and Francis here with us today, and I'd like to hand over to Frank to lead a discussion with the Mayor of Budapest, and then we'll be able to take some questions from the audience afterwards, so please do collect your thoughts on those. I believe you will have access to the chat bar at the bottom. If you want to put your questions in there while our speakers are talking, then we can field some of those on the other side. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Frank. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophia, for that introduction. It's a great honor to be on the same podium with Mayor Karácsony, somebody that's actually doing something to stop the spread of illiberal ideology in Europe. Let me begin by asking the mayor what the prospects are for actually unseating Viktor Orbán and the Fidesz party from power in Hungary. One thing a lot of right-wing nationalists have done is to change the rules of the democratic game to make it harder for them to lose power. And I'm aware in Hungary that this has happened through the gerrymandering of electoral districts. It's happened through Orbán's control of the Hungarian media and other techniques. On the other hand, you are the mayor of Budapest, and so there does seem to be some opportunity and space for some alternative political voices. So maybe you could tell us what you think the future holds in terms of a return of genuine democratic contestation to Hungary.
Again, thank you very much for the invitation. This is a major honor that I can have Professor Fukuyama here. I can talk to Professor Fukuyama. I've read a lot of his books, and these were of major inspirations in my scientific career, but also as a politician. I think I can use a lot of things that he wrote to build upon. Well, yes, if we want to understand what is happening in Hungary today, it is worth taking count of the changes that took place in the constitutional system that Viktor Orbán, made in the constitutional system in order to monopolize power. This would be a very long list, but as far as the political competition is concerned, is the gerrymandering, so the redrawing of the electoral map. Now, this type of change, and each and every element of this change, from the tiniest technical element to the basic principle of the electoral system, this was in order to, or with a view to having a divided opposition, and on the other side to have a monolithic Fidesz state power block. Now, this electoral system or voting system or election system, is a very election system, not electoral. So this election system is very anti-democratic, but it has different elements, and the elements individually appear in other democratic and election systems. But all in all, it is very anti-democratic. Now, a new element during the elections, it is going to take place in April 2022 in Hungary. So in the previous elections, the opposition was fragmented, was divided. And this is why Viktor Orban came up with this new system of elections. And the previous two elections were such that the opposition had to divide their power. And although altogether they had more votes, but as opposed to that, or despite that, Viktor Orban and his party had a ruling majority in parliament. Now, I had been involved in political sciences, and at the university I also taught political sciences and election systems, and I told my students several times that when a new election system, a new system of elections is introduced in a country, you need at least 2 election cycles before the parties and the voters themselves could adapt to that. Hungary seems to be a schoolbook, a textbook example, because this is going to be the 3rd election in a row when the opposition had a genuine strategy against Fidesz, and and this type of system forced the opposition to have to unite their powers, to join hands. When the bill for the current system of elections was submitted to Parliament as a draft legislation, back then I already said that only the opposition joining forces and acting together would give them the chance of overthrowing or replacing Fidesz. But as a matter of fact, it also has to be noted and said that the parties of the opposition are very different, from liberal and left-wing parties to right-wing, extreme right-wing parties. In 2011, when the new election system was introduced, obviously they were unable to cooperate and collaborate. Since then, the former far-right Jobbik party just did away or has done away with its very extreme rhetorics, and therefore it became possible to have a common platform for the opposition parties as a viable alternative. That was a sine qua non of the cooperation. But again, it was the pressure of the opposition voters that forced this unity to be formulated by the opposition parties. Now, there is a very significant headwind, we have to say, but still there is a realistic or real opportunity for the opposition to win the elections, and not only because they are united, they are fully united, but there's another factor here, which again is in line with the vision that I stand for. And this is that the candidates, that is the Prime Minister candidate and also the candidates for the different electoral districts, they are going to measure themselves in a pre-election cycle, a process of pre-election. And this is very important because this provides for the active participation of voters, and this is very necessary to create that force, the critical weight that it takes to overthrow the current regime. And this is also a response to the politics of the government, which actually you can feel on your skin day by day, and which actually just empties out the institutional system of representative democracy. So this is a participative democracy. This is by involving citizens, actively involving voters and citizens. And this is one element. And the other element, as I said, is the full unity and the full cooperation of the opposition parties. These are the major changes, and this is what gives us a fair chance of winning the elections, despite the fact that, despite the headwind and despite the resources that are still on the side of Fidesz.
Well, I'm sure everybody in this audience really wishes the opposition good luck in being able to stick together and to successfully contest the next election. Can you tell me what the effect of the COVID epidemic has been internally in terms of Orban's standing. I know that one of the first things he did after the epidemic hit was to get Parliament to give him emergency powers. And I remember at the time everybody assuming that he really wasn't going to give these powers back once the health crisis abated. But does he have, extraordinary powers to manipulate election results that are the result of COVID? Did the performance in dealing with the epidemic change his standing among Hungarian voters? How would you assess the impact of the last year and a half?
Well, yes, in fact, these types of regimes are just looking for or happy to have such crises because then they can, grab more power. But populists normally like crises that they trigger themselves. They trigger these crises through communications and through tools and means of communications. And the Hungarian government is a world champion in generating and triggering crises. They are always at war with the European Union, they are at war with the international actors, they are always prepared to war. There is a war preparedness, which always justifies those measures that just limit democracy or curb democracy. Now, the number one crisis that had to be solved was obviously the pandemic, the COVID, and the extraordinary legal order. So the special legal order is still in force, and the government is just about to extend it, to prolong it. As a mayor of Budapest, what I experienced, unfortunately, was that in this era, in this period, it was not only the rights of the parliament, which are quite formal anyway, so it was not the rights of the parliament that were curbed, but rather the municipal system, the local governments, which are checks and balances, which are balances of, which are part of the checks and balances. So the municipalities, the local governments were curbed and limited. When I was elected in 2019, it was not only Budapest, but most of the big cities in Hungary. There was a turn, and opposition mayors were elected in those big cities. So the opposition got into a situation that they were able to showcase real governance, good governance. And during the pandemic, during the COVID pandemic, there were a lot of examples where when myself and other municipalities also sort of forced the government to make steps. So it was quite a lot of measures of the government were just triggered and brought about by actions of the municipalities and mayors. And there was a price to pay, of course, because when the COVID was at its peak, what they did was the full emptying out the pockets of municipalities entirely, despite the fact that local governments and municipalities are always, and in Hungary too, they're suffering of a lack of resources, lack of funding, and in most of Europe there were different packages and different measures helping local governments. In Hungary too, it was just the opposite. The Budapest municipality was stripped from 30% of its revenues in a period when they were badly in need of this funding. So this was again just a hit on the municipalities, and this very well shows how heated and how wide the competition is going to be during the elections, and also that the alternative showcased by the opposition is life-threatening for the government, because they made huge mistakes when handling the pandemic. In Hungary, the toll we had to pay was very high. The death rate was one of the highest, and this is the saddest but the strongest criticism of the measures and the way they managed the crisis. Now, as again, they used, all in all, they used the pandemic to try to cement their power, and the victims were primarily the local governments, municipalities. Back to you.
So could you say a little bit about the impact of external actors on internal Hungarian politics, and there's three that are important. So one is obviously the European Union, the second would be the United States, and the third would be China. But I'd like you to answer each one separately. So let's begin with the European Union. The EPP finally decided to get rid of Fidesz as part of its parliamentary bloc. But you know, I'm curious how that played out inside Hungary and whether it did actually do anything to Hungary's standing. I know that there's been a controversy within the EU as to the solidarity funds that were generated because of the pandemic and whether there should be any conditionality placed on Hungary to abide by democratic norms if they were to receive those funds. And maybe you could tell us where that whole discussion stands, and in particular, what you want Europe to do. I mean, it seems to me outrageous. I believe Hungary, something like 4% of its GDP are the result of European transfers. And so a lot of the apparent economic health of Hungary is actually due to Europe, you know, contributing these funds, which seem to me not right given the way that Hungary was behaving. So what, you know, what ought, you know, appropriate European policy be towards this, towards your country?
Yes, indeed. This is a situation which is very difficult to understand vis-a-vis our EU membership. The way we could conclude or summarize that is that if we look at Viktor Orban's regime and look at the most important stabilizing factor of his regime, so the sole contributor which really contributes to its being up and running. Now, this is, however controversial it may sound, it is Hungary's EU membership, because the EU membership and the economic advantages coming with that membership contributes highly to the fact that the regime managed to sustain its power and keep its power. And despite the distortion that the Fidesz has inflicted, so distortion and corruption in the country, despite that the country is still up and running, this is simply because of the European transfers. Again, having said that, don't get me wrong, I'm very much a pro-European. I'm in favor of Hungary's membership in the EU. I don't think that Hungary's place is elsewhere. I don't think that the member states on the outer rim of the European Union should not get support transfers, or not that much. No, this is not a question. But it is, as a matter of fact, whether or not the Hungarian economy is competitive, whether or not the fact that the Hungarian government is just, the economic policy is just bleeding out the country, but this does not become evident because the transfers of the European Union are used to counterbalance that, and as a result of that, the Hungarian economy is still able to function properly. I could also say at the same time that as far as the Viktor Orban's regime is concerned, this is like the European transfers to this regime is like the natural gas for the regime of Putin, President Putin. So this is the means through which they can maintain the country's up and running, so the country's functionality or some sort of economic prosperity. Now, the institutional system of the European Union obviously wasn't prepared for this type of approach, that in democracy member states would not only go forward but would also go backwards. Now, Professor Fukuyama's book, which he wrote after the collapse of the communist regimes, now this was also something that you could trace in the European unity. But you could see that there are examples when someone goes back from democratic achievements and there are no sanctions. So if a member state reaches a certain level of democracy, a certain, and is above the line, then you don't have to be afraid that this democracy will be dismantled or would be limited. And we thought that if member states achieves European membership, so will become EU member, then there's no way back. But now we had to experience that, and unfortunately, that was not the case. And it took a lot of time for the EU to understand that and to respond to that. The Orban regime used their political aggressivity to sort of be successful within the European Union. I also think that, if I may come up with another criticism vis-à-vis the European Union, is that the fact that it took so long for the EPP to get rid of Fidesz, so that they tolerated Fidesz so long, this is also related to the fact that for Germany, for German exports, for the German industrials and the German capitalists, Hungary was a very good playground. So there were economic interests as well within the EU blocking or at least acting against the sanctions, the genuine sanctions of the European Union against the Orban regime, because the German industry made huge investments in Hungary, and they got a lot of support and subsidy from the Hungarian government. So I think there were economic considerations as well, which led to this long tolerance. But again, very appropriately, the European Union started to come up with sanctions, but these sanctions would not be sustainable on long run. So if the Orban regime, for some reason, remains in power, then I wouldn't support that the European Union would strip Hungary from these transfers. As the mayor of Budapest, we created the Pact of Free Cities in 2019, and just last week we had a forum in Budapest about that. And our lobbying activities primarily aims at getting direct subsidies from the EU. So instead of the EU making transfers to member states, they could make direct transfers to municipalities. But anyway, what I say is that we need to sort of be resilient, and we need to win the elections, and then we could relaunch these types of transfers. I don't see any better solution right now for this crisis situation. I think the opposition has to win the elections here.
Well, that's certainly a precondition for any kind of movement forward. So let's move to the next external actor, the United States. Orban had a very cozy relationship with Donald Trump, came to the US and, has been getting a lot of support from the extreme right. Now that we've got Joe Biden in the White House, you have a much less sympathetic president. Has that had any impact? How has that played out inside Hungary? Are people happy when a crackpot like Tucker Carlson comes to Budapest and, sucks up to all of the Fidesz leaders, or is that regarded as, a kind of embarrassment?
Nagyon fontos az elején tisztázni azt, hogy
It is very important to make certain things clear. So all the allegations that international superpowers want to intervene in Hungary's internal affairs, this is just a part of the communication pattern of Fidesz and Viktor Orban. This is obviously not the case. It is very important to clarify that in the beginning, because obviously this is an election. This will be an election that the Hungarian voters will have to decide. The fact that there is a different administration in the US, yes, it has a direct impact on Hungary's internal politics. And this can be best described by saying that Viktor Orban did not position himself as someone who's having a separate path, a separate way, and who's going against the direction of the rest of the world, offering a Hungarian solution. No, his internal legitimation was always based on the fact that he has strong allies allies around the world. And probably he might have been the first one to announce this politics, which is illiberalism and which is against the liberalism. But he has allies in Poland, in Israel, in the United States. I mean, this was part of the communications. Now, these allies are now getting fewer and fewer in number, because both in the US and both in Israel, this type of illiberal governance has come to an end. And within the European Union, it is only Hungary and Poland that remain, although there are some other countries that partly follow this trend. But all in all, Viktor Orbán today is a lonely wolf, or rather looks like a lonely wolf, with his ideas, with his views, and this actually has changed the rhetorics of Fidesz. So yes, it has a role, and it has had an impact. And despite the fact that the majority of the Hungarian voters are open to nationalism and nationalist rhetorics, but there is an important message as well. If Hungarians will be left alone, that is always something that always has meant something bad. And I think a lot of voters in Hungary feel or think that Hungary is a small country and is being left alone more and more, and this could have a direct impact to Hungarian internal politics.
Okay, so let me ask my last question before we open it up to the audience, and that is about the third external actor, which is China. It seems to me that China has been the big beneficiary of this very clumsy EU foreign policy system, where each individual member state can veto a foreign policy initiative, and the Chinese have been using this very effectively to prevent EU criticism of their treatment of the Uyghurs or human rights record or other things. How does China play in domestic Hungarian politics? I can't imagine that Hungarians are particularly proud of the fact that they're being supported by this communist regime of a very different background and culture. On the other hand, it is useful when you get money to support infrastructure projects and so forth. So maybe you could speak to China as an actor in your region.
Well, yes, Viktor Orbán's role within the European Union, and this is an important factor. So Viktor Orbán quite often uses his Hungary's EU membership to upgrade and upvalue the country and himself vis-à-vis China, vis-à-vis Putin's Russia, acting as if he could sort of have influence on the decision-making of the European Union. The fact, the role in the Southern Balkans, in Montenegro and in the Balkans, Hungary fought a lot within the European Commission so that the EU accession policy would be led by a Hungarian commissioner, which did happen. So in this respect, I think that as far as China is concerned, the partnership with Viktor Orbán has a strategic significance, which is related to the infrastructure investments that are crucial for getting Chinese goods to Europe and the European Union. Therefore, Hungary is a key actor in this respect. But the other thing is that Viktor Orbán plays in such a way that he wants to score in two opposite goals. So if he likes football very much, but he plays a dual game. At the same time, he wants to favor the EU and favor China at the same time. Professor wrote a lot about the fact that you can't have all of these actors being superpowers or leading powers of the world at the same time. And the big question is that in the future, to what extent could the EU become a genuine superpower, a bit differentiating itself from the United States and not only acting as, following the United States. Now, what the European Union does in terms of foreign policy, that triggers a lot of questions. But what really happens to us in Hungary is that a lot of major investments would take place in Hungary, funded by China, that would primarily serve Chinese business and economic interests without having any or barely any Hungarian interest. And this is very much in public discourse, and I think that the Orbán regime will have to pay a dear price for that, and that could be one of the reasons of their fall, of their being ousted from power, because most of the voters don't like this type of approach vis-a-vis China.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate all of your answers. I learned a great deal from what you've just said. By the way, my own personal opinion is that Europe is never going to be a powerful geopolitical actor unless they can fix that decision-making system with regard to foreign policy and centralize it so that they can actually be a much more decisive actor. But that's not the subject of our discussion today. So I'll turn things back over to Sophia and to the broader audience for their questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was such a fascinating conversation. Now, I can't see a flurry of questions coming into the chat. So what we might do is if people want to sort of mull over their questions, and we can maybe put hands up, or if you can start to feed your questions into the chat, so we can raise hands, and I'll take a selection. I'm aware we don't have an enormous amount of time, so we might need to bring a couple of them together, but let's have a go. So we've got a couple of hands coming up now, so why don't we start with you, Suzanne? If you could just say your name and just introduce yourself as well, that would be wonderful.
There we go. Suzanne Garment with American Purpose. Could you talk for a moment about the role of domestic corruption in sustaining the regime?
Okay, so probably a question directed to the mayor there, the role of domestic corruption in sustaining the regime.
Azt gondolom, hogy a magyarországi korrupció az
Well, I do believe that domestic corruption is just a natural and imminent part of the regime, partly because the Orbán government or the Orbán regime is an example of an extreme accumulation of power. And of course, this requires certain economic power circles. So, companies that are media companies that are running media, and through which they can become indirect part of everyday politics. So they just don't want to take risks, and therefore one of the reasons of corruption is that they want the immense concentration of power, the enormous concentration of power. In addition to that, they want to have control over all resources that could play a role in the elections, and that takes a lot of money. They need money to keep up the media, to build their party structure and party organization. They need money to rid the opposition from the resources which are required, obviously, in a functioning democracy. And the third factor is the system of clientele. So the whole system has to be the machinery has to be greased, and they also want to achieve a certain, they want to get support from the great masses, and for this reason they need a lot of money. There are a lot of careers, a lot of positions which are dependent upon the political successes of the party, and this actually underpins, or this just strengthens the stability of the regime, but at the same time makes the regime more unpopular or less popular, as you will. a significant part of the voters have alienated themselves from Fidesz exactly because of corruption. And from that respect, you know, the pros that you have in one of these scales because of getting a lot of money and using the corruption for that. But at the same time, in the other scales, you have a lot of lack of popularity because most of the Hungarian voters have had enough of corruption. Corruption is one of the most important factors why they could be ousted.
Yes, absolutely. When I was doing some public opinion research focus groups last year in Hungary, it was very clear that corruption was an issue that seemed to agitate people on all sides of the political spectrum. So let's go out to some more questions. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, but Avietsa Tucker, I think you were next.
Thank you. I'm Avietsa Tucker. I'm a political theorist, mostly of post-communist Europe. Question about election strategy. In 3 weeks, there will be elections in the Czech Republic, and the populist light regime there attempts to win the elections by creating artificial prosperity. They massively increased the pensions for old age pensioners, with the unintended side effect that they absorb now the votes of the Social Democrats and the Communist parties. So it could be the first time since 1989 that there will be no communists and no Social Democrats in parliament. And though the populists may come first, they will not have a governing coalition. Could Orban do something like that? Number two, what do you see the prospect for Israeli-style Midsummer Night's Dream coalition? You know, the donkey with the princess. People who really don't fit each other, the Islamists and the right-wingers. Can you hold this, something like that in Hungary, come to some kind of reasonable compromise that they do in Israel, or give autonomy to various government ministries to have contradictory policies, as long as you hold together? And would the Israeli foreign minister, second-generation Hungarian, Yair Lapid, help you?
Okay, so a bunch of questions there on electoral strategy and electoral possibilities.
Azt gondolom, hogy a magyar belpolitika azért sok szempontból
I do believe that Hungarian internal domestic politics is different in many ways from these two examples mentioned, although trends can be identified, of course. As a matter of fact, yes, in Israel we have a multicolor, a very diverse coalition that contributed to the ousting of Netanyahu's government, or replacing Netanyahu's government. In this respect, the situation, the situation is similar in Hungary. So as far as the first question is concerned, in this respect, yes. But, you know, today we are preparing a coalition of 6 parties. They are preparing for a coalition government. But 10 years ago, these parties could have not imagined to work together in this way, let alone sitting in the same government. One thing is sure and certain, these parties have changed to their benefit. So it's not only that we have an enemy that we all hate so much that we have forgotten our own past. No, it is also about the fact that these parties have converged to a little bit. So they grew to come closer. On the one hand, the far right is to a certain extent has domesticated or has been domesticated, and now they are fighting for EPP membership. They want to take the place of Fidesz in the European People's Party. But the post-communist parties that you, sir, were referring to in the Czech Republic, these parties are also present in Hungarian domestic politics or internal politics, but these parties also have done away with their political heritage and past that they represented before 2010. As opposed to neoliberal economic policy, they rather focused on a national program, which I partly agree with, because part of the political success of the Orban regime was brought about the fact that the market reforms after the political transformation took a high toll. Now, the other thing is that the nationality issue is a very important issue in the Hungarian public discourse and Hungarian public opinion. And of course, as we see in Ivan Klastev's book, it was a sort of a mechanical copycat, so just copying what Western Europe was doing or had been doing. This was the first approach, but this has changed significantly. So this, again, is not only an anti-Orban coalition, but a coalition that we can trust will work properly after the elections if they get in power.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So, okay, we have a few more questions and time for a few more. So the next is, we have someone dialing in. I'm afraid I don't have your name. So if you could just introduce yourself. It's this person dialing in from 140 onwards. I think you were next. Okay. Right. I can't hear you. So because we're a bit short on time, we might come back to you. Let's go to Mark Plattner.
Yes, hello. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Okay, good. Yes, I'm Mark Plattner. I'm the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy. And I have been amazed by the way that Orban has managed to present himself as a defender of Western civilization and at the same time to pursue policies friendly to China. And my question really is there not significant hostility on the part of Hungarian voters to his pro-China policies, and I would think pro-Russia policies as well? Is that a central issue in any future election, or is it the case that voters don't care about foreign policy? Thank you.
Interesting. So how does Orban square his defense of Western civilization while looking relaxed towards two potential kind of existential threats to Western civilization in both Russia and China?
Well, polls indicate that, and public opinion shows that a vast majority of voters and also a significant part of Fidesz voters do reject Hungary's pro-Russia and pro-China policy. The big question is to what extent we can keep these topics in public discourse every day. So to what extent can we put this into the focus of the election process? And taking the media landscape and the media conditions in Hungary, this is not going to be easy. There is an issue which I consider very important as a mayor of Budapest, and this is the investment which is called the Fudan University in Budapest. This has triggered very harsh criticism. Not the fact alone that Fudan, a Chinese communist university, would pull into Hungary into a Hungarian campus, but this would be made from Hungarian taxpayers' money, I mean using Hungarian taxpayers' money, and this would just limit the size of the campus that Budapest wanted to create for university students. We made a public opinion research polls, and 80% of the voters do reject this investment. But when I started my campaign against the Fudan University, then the government came up with an initiative to have a popular vote with a sort of a secondary story. This came about sexual minorities and sexual behaviors and so forth. This is what they want to have the popular voting on, as opposed to talking about the Fudan University. So again, the question is to what extent we can keep this in the focus of public discourse, but it is a fact that even Fidesz voters are very critical in this respect.
Wonderful. So we'll just have, we'll take another question, and then I'm also aware that the mayor may also want to pose a question to our esteemed co-speaker, Frank Fukuyama. So if the mayor wants to sort of ruminate over that while we take another question from the audience. So I think next in line we have Fritz Heinzen.
Good afternoon. I've been reading that Orban says he fears there will be U.S. interference in the election. I would rather, though, value your opinion as to what you're seeing in the way of possible foreign interference and what you fear may yet come in the way of foreign interference in the election. Thank you.
Well, governments like Orban, the Orban government, they have a very simple political recipe or trick, rather, that they use. They are conditioning the minds of voters, saying that the interest of the nation is in line with the politics of the government, is also the interest of the government, and vice versa. So any criticism against the Orban government, is a criticism against Hungary. Therefore, this is a betrayal, betraying Hungary's interest. It's important to know that Hungarian national identity gives a wide maneuvering space for these types of manipulations, because in the Hungarian history we had a lot of disasters and cataclysms when it was really a major tragedy in the fate of the nation. Just like Poland, Hungary too experienced what it feels like when you cease to exist as a state, as a nation, as a country. Now these traumas are deeply embedded in Hungarian public thinking. So they're always open to thoughts that this is a threat that may just result in Hungary as a nation and a country ceasing to exist. However, there is no external intervention that would threaten Hungary's or the Orban regime, but there are external interventions that keep the Fidesz and Orban in power. We are prepared that the Russian and the Chinese influence will appear in the elections, because if they manage to appear in the American elections, if they manage to appear in the Brexit elections, or in Germany, or when there was a fake news campaign against the Green candidate for the chancellor seat, so then I think we have to be prepared for such interventions, and we are just glad if the opposition will have allies like in the United States, or if it has friends in EU member states. But we know, because we know exactly that this is a fight that we ourselves will have to fight. But again, any type of intervention is just contrary to the democratic vision that we have and we want to use when fighting our fights.
Thank you. And Mayor Gergely, did you have any questions that you wanted to pose to Frank before we close off the session?
Yes, let me just use this opportunity to also ask questions from Professor Fukuyama. Well, as a matter of fact, the most important question I have, as I mentioned in my speech, your opinion about the competition between China and the United States. We all know that this is going to be a major question of European Union's global politics as well. So the question is, Professor, what do you suggest? What is your recommendation or advice to the European Union? What should they do when going forward on the stance of liberal democracy, taking these two important external factors into account, and like the strategic partnership between China and the EU? What do you think about that? What do you think about the fact that President Macron says that the EU should have a separate and independent foreign policy, an autonomous foreign policy in the future? So to what extent do you think this will help the international embeddedness of the European Union?
Frank, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now? So I believe that all of those initiatives that you mentioned are bad and they should be dropped. I think the commercial investment treaty between the EU and China was a bad idea from the start. I don't think it's going to be ratified. I think that this idea of Macron's that you mentioned and other Europeans who somehow see the EU as a floating bloc that could go with China on some issues and with the US on others is also a ridiculous idea, because China does not share any of Europe's values, basic values, and it's just not going to be the case that Europe can be even-handed in treating it. Now, I know that the French are really mad at the United States right now, and that there's a lot of friction in that traditional alliance relationship, but you have to take a longer term view of these things. And I think in the long run, these basic democratic values will be determinative. And I think that Europe has to figure out how to compete with China. For example, you know, the idea that Europe should have a separate technological capability to produce semiconductors, that it ought to bolster its own firms like Ericsson and Nokia that can produce 5G equipment. Those are all good ideas. And I really hope that Europe gets its act together in terms of, you know, improving its capacity to really compete in these technological areas with China. So that's my opinion about that set of questions.
Fascinating. Thank you. I mean, gosh, it'd be wonderful just to keep wading through this discussion. There's clearly so much more to get stuck into here, but I think we've had a really important flavor of some of the key sort of both conceptual and practical issues that our speaker here, the Mayor of Budapest, is wading through in the sort of quite, you know, real-time practical application of some of these things that we are often exploring in a much more theoretical place. So again, just the combination of having both the seer and the doer and the thinker about liberalism, I think has really enriched this conversation. And thank you to all those who've put forward questions as well. They were all excellent. I just want to close this session with two thoughts. I think the first is that one thing that really struck me doing social research in Hungary and also in other places like Poland and Ukraine is that, you know, apathy and cynicism and fractured social trust seem to be very powerful forces. And I think we need to be very attuned to those developing in our societies. And I don't think that any advanced liberal democracy at the moment can be complacent about those. And the second thought is just about liberalism and its relationship with pluralism. And it seems to me that there is a question of how we can make liberalism something that is defined, distinct, robust, and muscular enough around which to build a nation, and also to adapt to these new challenges in the 21st century. So it's wonderful to have had these opportunities to talk through some of these things. Thank you very much to Francis Fukuyama. Thank you to Meg Gergely, and thank you to the audience as well. And I'll hand back to Jeff if you want to say a couple of words at the end. Thank you.
So thank you so much, all of you. This is part of a 3-day virtual conference marking 1 year American Purpose. You can see the full program online. Join us at 2 p.m. Eastern today with Bob Zellick for a discussion of U.S. foreign policy. But to the main event at this moment, by the way, Alex, thank you for wonderful simultaneous interpretation. Sophia, that was absolutely elegant, the way you managed and led this conversation. Frank, your co-managing and your direction of the conversation is deeply appreciated. And Mr. Mayor, thanks. This was informationally rich, stimulating, encouraging. We're indebted to you. We wish you all the best. And let us see you sometime in Washington, D.C. Or if I may say, and I bet I represent most, if not all of this audience today, let us see you in gorgeous, beautiful Budapest. But thank you, Mr. Mayor. You would have the final word if you liked.
Köszönöm szépen a kérdéseket. És,
Well, I would just like to thank everyone for these questions because it is always very honoring if Hungary just triggers attention with international partners. Unfortunately, I'm very well aware of the fact that it's rather a bad reputation that makes us interesting nowadays. But having said that, I'm really glad for the interest you've shown. And just one final word. Populists always want to pretend as they are representing the nation. Hungarian nation is not identical with Viktor Orban. And I know that you know this very well. But again, whenever I talk with international partners or to international partners, this is always my closing remark. Of course, there are a lot of Hungarians who support Orban's politics. There also are fellow countrymen, but Orban Viktor is not identical with the Hungarian nation. Thank you very much for this discussion. I hope that in a couple of months' time we can provide you with good news.
So Gergely, Frank, Sophia, and everybody who spent time, thank you so much. Feel free, if you like, to switch your camera on to say goodbye and wish good afternoon and good evening. And thank you, everybody. What a fabulous conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nagyon köszönöm.